This is Dan Schneider, and on this edition of the Dan Schneider video interview, I will be talking about poetry translation with two well-known men and translators in the field. On your left, you see Edward Snow, who is a translator who's most well known for translating the poems of Rainer Maria Rilke. And on the right, you will see Robert Tracy, a man who I first encountered reading the poems of Osip Mandelstam, a Russian poet, but who has also translated other people. And when we return, we will talk with both of them about the art and the problems and the goodness of poetry translation.
Archaic Torso Apollos, a Rainer Maria Rilke. Wer kennte nicht sein unerhörtes Hauf, darin der Augenäpfel reifen. Aber sein Torso glüht noch wie ein Kandelaber, in dem sein Schaun, nur zurückgeschraubt, sich hält und glänzt. Sonst konnte nicht die buckte Brust dick blinten, und im leisen Drehen der Linten konnte nicht ein Lacklen gehen zu jener Mitte, die Saigon trug. Sonst stand dieser Stein entstellt und kurz, unter de Schultern durch die Gemsters, und flammiet nicht so wie Raubtierfälle, und brach nicht aus allen seinen Rändern, als wie ein Stern, denn da ist keine Stelle, die dich nicht sieht. Du musst dein Leben ändern. Archaic Torso of Apollo by Rainer Maria Rilke. Translation by Edward Snow. We never knew his head in all the light that ripened in his fabled eyes. But his torso still glows like a candelabra, in which his gazing, turned down low, holds fast and shines. Otherwise the surge of the breast could not blind you, nor a smile run through the slight twist of the loins toward that center where procreation thrived. Otherwise this stone would stand deformed and curt, under the shoulders in visible plunge, and not glisten just like wild beast's fur, and not burst forth from all its contours like a star. For there is no place that does not see you. You must change your life.
Talking with Edward Snow and Robert Tracy. They both want to be addressed more informally, so I'll be talking with Bob and Ed. So let me just say I have been reading and writing poetry for decades now, and both of your works I encountered back in the 1980s in another century. And poetry translation is one of those things that a lot of people I don't think understand or really appreciate. So in this segment, I want to introduce both of you guys and have you introduce yourselves a little bit to our viewers, and also then talk a little bit about the history of poetry translation in general. So on the left, there is Ed Snow, and on the right, there is Bob Tracy. So let me start left to right. And Ed, let me just give you 2 or 3 minutes to tell people a little bit about yourself, how you got into poetry and poetry translation in specific, and what you may be most well known for. So,
well, okay, I've always taught English, and I didn't start out with any desire to do translation at all. I was trained as a Shakespearean. My first years were at Berkeley, where everybody was a Shakespearean. So I got courses to teach where I could more or less invent the content and teach, shall we say, the life of fiction the way we were able to do it back in the 70s. And two figures who just appealed to me for what felt like the same reason, although I didn't interrogate or theorize that reason, were the painter Vermeer and the poet Rilke. So at the same time, I just got involved in fiddling around with Rilke translations. I was writing a book on Vermeer, this all the time while I was teaching courses in Shakespeare and expected to come up with a book by Marlowe. As far as kind of how I got interested, as usual, with me, it's less a less getting interested in an activity than with a particular figure, the particular works of a particular figure. It wasn't so much translation that got me started, the art of translation that got me started, but the figure of Rilke and the poetry of Rilke, which I would teach in translation. And of course, like everyone else, feel at certain moments in the translations I was using that something was being missed. And just started fiddling around, and fiddling turned into the last 20 years of my life as I've translated one book after another of Rilke's. The same thing happened. Rilke and Vermeer were very much to me figures that my interest pursued along parallel paths. At the same time I was doing this, I was writing a book on Vermeer. So I'm a teacher of English. Probably the thing that connects everything I do is a commitment to close reading. I mean, close reading, and talking about Vermeer completely in terms of visual details, and then translating, which started feeling more and more to me like the close reading. So that's how I definitely come to translation as trained as a literary critic, and committed to what now seems the old-fashioned art of close reading, as it were.
Yeah, that's an interesting connection you make between Vermeer and Rilke, because I've often, in the back of my mind, when I'm reading a poem, I get images that are very Vermeerian, and other Dutch masters. Rilke has these moments in the best translations. I read a little bit of German. My last name's Schneider, so I was raised in a German household. But he has these intense moments, but it's often the things that make his greatest poems are the things in the spaces that are left out. And of course with Vermeer, that's the same thing visually. It's the gaps between the figure and maybe something on the opposite side of the room. So that's a very interesting connection.
Actually, go ahead.
No, go ahead. I'm done.
I never thought of the connection between them in that way, although that's fascinating to think about. But certainly the sense of, I hate to fall back on terms like depth.
Yeah.
But because all great poets and painters are deep, but Rilke and Vermeer always seem to me to be exploring the same depths, trying to get the same depths, kind of unobtrusively into play.
We had a little video difficulty there, but I got Bob Tracy back online. So let me turn to you, Bob. We just heard Ed talk about his introduction and his interest in poetry translation. Let me ask you to tell our viewers a little bit about yourself, your interest in writing.
Well, like Ed, I'm a professor of English. That was my primary activity. But I went to a Jesuit high school. Was mostly, I got into the idea of translating, dealing with other languages fairly early. What sent me to take the idea of translating seriously was a course that I took as a graduate student at Harvard. My degree is not in English, but in comparative literature. And I worked with English, with French, and with Russian. And one of the Russian courses I took in 20th century Russian literature meant twice a week for the professor to lecture, but he scheduled a third meeting for those of us who had some knowledge of the Russian language. And what we did there was translating. So that's where I first encountered Mandelstam, Gubaryov, Anna Akhmatova, and that whole group of Russian poets that are called the Silver Age. And some years passed, and a friend of mine here in Berkeley was editing, one of the three women editing the Penguin Book of Women's Poetry. And she asked me if there were any Russian women poets. And I said, yes, there is, especially Anna Akhmatova. Well, will you translate a couple of poems for us? Sure. And I did. And it was a long time since I'd done any translating, but I'm kind of took to it. I said, this is something I'd like to do. But I'm not talking about Irish poetry.
Hold up. Go ahead.
Where was I?
You're talking about the Russians.
Translating on Akhmatova. And I did translate a couple of poems. They were in the anthology that I worked for, but I thought I'd like to do more of this. And the second feeling that I had was, these poems are for a woman to translate. They're so very intensely a woman's point of view. But there was Mandelstam, who was her close friend and contemporary. So I thought, let's take a look at Mandelstam and see what I can do with that. So I translated Mandelstam's first book, which was called Stone, published originally in 1908. And there were 80, when it grew, he added to it. Ultimately, there were 80 poems. And so that translated them, and eventually Princeton, which had a program of translating poetry from other languages into English, took the book, and it came out. Since then, I've translated, though not yet published, a Mandelstam's second book called Tristia. And kind of having caught the bug, I've done a little bit more. I've translated, with considerable help from the poet herself, some poems by a very gifted Irish poet named Nuala O'Connell, who writes in Irish. Oh. And I've even ventured into translating a little from ancient Egyptian, from the Book of the Dead. So,
well, that leads into my one of the questions I was going to ask. First, I was going to ask that if you translated other than Russians, but since you've translated now Egyptian and also from the Cyrillic language, and also Irish, what do you find easier to translate? Roman alpha languages or non-Roman alpha languages? Is there more leeway if you're doing a Cyrillic language that most Western European peoples couldn't read? Do you have more freedom, or do you find, which do you prefer and why?
I don't think you have a lot of freedom. The Cyrillic language is not a problem because, as I said, I was exposed to Greek when I was in high school, so the Cyrillic alphabet close to the Greek alphabet, so that was that's not a barrier. I don't think I've found that I need to show translations. I've been lucky in having access to people who are American people, but whose family language is Russian, and I've had a great deal of help in both occasions by someone like that who would read over and say, well, not quite the right way of saying this. And particularly when I was doing the Mandelstam, the first Mandelstam volume, I got my colleagues in the Russian department. I said, I figured that everybody would read at least 10 poems. So I fired them out, and I got useful criticism saying, well, this is not quite the way we would say it in Russia. So I did have some coaching, I guess you'd say. Some,
how about you, Ed?
Assistance.
Okay. Ed, hold on. Not that again.
It says, again, your video is turned off.
Yeah. Can you turn it back on? Let's keep it. I'll just keep it running here. Hold on. Okay, it's coming back up.
Is that it?
Yeah, it's coming back up. Is it saying any reason why it keeps?
No, it doesn't say.
No, okay. We'll just have to deal with it. So let me just continue then. Ed, have you translated any non-Roman language, Alpha Roman languages?
No, and in fact, I'm a kind of anomaly. This discussion in particular, because I've translated 10 volumes of poetry now, but they've all been of Rilke. So I've been translating for 20 years, but I've never published any translation that wasn't a work from a work by Rilke. So not only is German to English, the only kind of translation work I've done.
How about prose? Have you done prose from Rilke, Letters to a Young Poet?
That was true. That turned out to be very, very tricky and illuminating at the same time. The one massive correspondence, the complete correspondence between Rilke and Lou Andreas Salome. Yeah. I co-translated with a colleague of mine in the German department. And then Rilke's 3 early diaries that Luke assigned him to do at the turn of the century. I also co-translated that with my colleague Michael Winkler. It's funny how on the one level Rilke's poetry is so much more complex and full of conundra than his prose, and yet I felt completely capable of taking on Duino elegies by myself.
Yeah.
When I suddenly had a big mass of prose, I just intensely felt the need to be co-translating with a native speaker.
Okay. Bob, you flipped out there, but you came back video-wise. Have you done, I think you said you've done prose translations as well, have you not?
No, I don't think so, no.
Okay. Because I was going to ask, especially in Russian, there are a lot of people who have translated Russian who hate the Constance Garnett translations of prose fiction, and I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on that yourself, about specifically Garnett. She's probably the most well-known translator from the Russian, Tolstoy and Dostoevsky and all.
Well, yes, Constance Garnett translated everything, practically, and she did know Russian very well. Any time I've taught Russian literature in a class, I've always chosen some other translator. So at the moment, I've very recently taught a freshman seminar in Crime and Punishment, and I used the Pevere translation, a very recent one, which I think is very good.
Okay.
So no, I've always used the different translation of War and Peace, which was approved by Tolstoy himself. He knew English himself pretty well, and he approved of the translation. So I'm afraid I don't think very highly of. Constance Garnett did introduce Russian literature to the English-speaking world, but I don't really find that a lot of her translations sound rather the same.
Okay.
The writers who are very, very different.
Yeah. Ed, you look like you wanted to say something about Garnett?
Oh no, that was fine. I was going to ask Bob.
Go ahead.
Specifically about the Garnett. He found lacking, but he went on to say pretty clearly what it was.
Okay. Well, let me ask you, Ed, regarding Rilke, because one of the things I've often found is that oftentimes I've read people who are great prose writers write poetry, like a Eugene O'Neill, who I last month did a show on with 3 experts on O'Neill, and his poetry is not good. And then you have people like Whitman or Rilke who wrote great poetry. And I think, like, if you look at Specimen Days by Whitman or the Letters to the Young Poet by Rilke, they are so far beneath the poetry. And I was wondering if, since you translated both of them, if you had any thoughts. Well, one, do you agree to me that Rilke's poetry is far greater than his prose? And if so, what do you think accounts for that? Do you think there's simply people who have a prose mind versus a poetic mind?
Well, Rilke would kind of be the counter argument to that. Letters to a Young Poet, its existence just drives me crazy, because I feel like it's like, the Rilke I want to kind of counteract with some really tough translations of his of his of his really kind of daring poems. But when I think of Rilke and prose, especially prose fiction, I think of the notebooks of Malta Large Brigga,
Yeah.
and that is a fantastic piece of prose writing, I think. So it just happens to be the only work of prose, I mean, the only that he wrote during his mature years. But on the basis of that, I would say that Rilke was had the capacity to be as revolutionary and radical and successful, writing lyric modernist prose fiction as he did the kind of poetry he wrote.
Okay.
Same thing with his letters. His letters are kind of amazing. Sometimes he would write 10 and 12 letters a day, and some of them would be, 6 and 8 pages long. I mean, so they're letters, so you can't really compare them to himself as a poet. But on the other hand, as pieces of the genre of letter writing, the best ones are just stunning.
Okay. For our viewers to know, Bob's been having some problems with, Bob has been having some problems with his video. He just blinked in and out this, but he's back. Let me just ask you then, Ed, regarding Rilke, because I do have a book of A. Poulin's translation of Rilke's French poems. Have you ever tried translating the French poems? Because Rilke might be the only person who ever wrote great poems in more than one language. He's only got maybe 4 or 5 French poems that I would probably consider great. The bulk of them, a few dozen, are in the native German. Have you ever tried the French? What do you think of Rilke's French poems versus his German?
Well, I hate to form an opinion about something that I don't know enough about to really be qualified. There was a time when my Rilke project could have been really complete Rilke. And at that time I took a look at the French poetry and felt like there was just nothing or very little in the French poetry that engaged me in that primal way that his German poetry did. So just the whole process of bringing the French over into English didn't feel to me like it was only in the rarest cases did it yield something that was even vaguely comparable to what he does in German when he writes in German. And then on the other hand, it seemed to me the translations of the French poetry that already existed were good enough.
Okay. Bob, are you still with us?
Yep.
Okay, we're still having some video problems, but let me ask you then, and we'll end this segment with this question to both of you. But I'll wait until your video comes back. I'll direct it first to Ed. Was there any translator that most influenced you in the way you approached translation? For example, a lot of people nowadays will do a transliteration word for word, and then they'll sort of, try to get it, parse it into sentences, and then do the enjambment or whatnot. How do you approach translating a poem? Do you do it more organically, or do you do it, building it up bit by bit? And was there any translator that influenced you? This is to Ed Snow, and then I'll ask Bob.
Okay. In a sense, those are 2 different questions for me, and I can answer both of them. Okay. There wasn't any translator who influenced me in the way you describe. I I never took a course in translation. You know, I never thought I would be doing translation until late in my in my middle years. I suppose the translation that triggered me, you know, that really made me start experimenting with the possibility of what I could do with Rilke's German. And this is probably true for a lot of other post 1984 translators of Rilke, was of course Stephen Mitchell's great Selected Rilke.
Yeah.
There, I started reading translations of poems that I was always had to read it in Leishman or McIntyre, where the only conclusion I could draw was that it was just completely futile to try to translate Rilke into English. Reading Mitchell, it was suddenly the ball game was completely different because there, not only was he wildly successful, but suddenly the possibility, it was a real, you know, living possibility. And then it just became a matter of reading Mitchell very closely over against the German, kind of seeing what he was doing, where he was kind of taking sorts of, where his philosophy of translation, tacit formula translation, seemed to be verging from what mine was. So then it was, first of all, being inspired by Mitchell, and then kind of feeling over against what he was doing. Was it possible to do something a little bit different, a little more stringent maybe, a little darker? So in both those senses, he's been certainly the biggest influence on me.
Well, yeah, and Mitchell's Rilke translations came out maybe a half a decade or more before yours, and generally you and Mitchell are considered the top two Rilke translators of the last 30 years or so. And the difference that most people point to is that Mitchell will sometimes insert words that weren't in the original to get the feeling, whereas you're more faithful to what's there, and so that's a good comparison.
Yeah, of course, all of us do that at some point at crucial moments. And that's one of the things you have to even if you want to be, which I do, is as quote faithful to the German as possible. But that's infinitely problematic, because sometimes to be faithful to what you really feel, to the kind of core moments in the poem, you have to kind of invent something. You know, if you just do the literal translation of the words, you get something completely dead, right where the poem really comes to life. You know, I do think that Stephen is the last thing I want to do is I very seldom do. I'm glad to be here. I very seldom do dialogues like this because I've spent my whole life not saying anything about other translators, but there do seem to be moments where you can either it's a crux of the poem, and you can either go in the direction that will make the poem, shall we say, reader friendly,
yeah,
or you can push it in a direction where it becomes strange.
Okay.
And I guess I feel like maybe I'm more interested in preserving all that strangeness in Rilke.
Okay.
Than Stephen is.
Okay. Bob, are you there still?
Yep, I'm here.
Okay. We don't have your video, but if you can hear me, let me turn that question to you. Have you, in your poetry translations, was there a model, a person that you looked at the translations of someone? It could have been non-Russian that you said, "Oh, that's the approach that I want to take," and if so, can you tell why?
Well, no, the approach that I've taken always is a rather pedestrian one, looking up every word, even if I thought I knew the meaning. I still look it up to make sure I've got it right, and there aren't possibilities. And I think this gives me some of the breadth of choice that the original poet, that Mandelstam himself, had when he set out to write a poem, so that I really do plod through it just the first step is writing out in longhand each word and then trying to connect them correctly, grammatically, and so on. And after that, then you sort of elaborate on that. So it's really starts very, very, very basic level. And I think that I use the word pedestrian deliberately because Mandelstam, as you probably remember, has a theory that the feet in poetry are the feet that the poet walks, and the rhythm of his walk becomes the feet. He talks about Dante, how many pairs of goatskin shoes did Dante wear out walking on the stony paths of Italy when he was composing the Commedia. And so Mandelstam was a walking poet. He made up his poets on the hoof, so to speak. He'd go for a long walk and come back with a poem. And he really strongly believed that the rhythm of his movement and the beat of his foot on the street, on the sidewalk, remained in the poem. It was very much a part of the act of composition as he did it.
I was going to end on that question, but both of you brought up something, so I'll end this segment with a final thought, and it's regarding metaphor and metaphor that's specific to a language or a culture and how that translates. For example, I don't know if it's true, but let's say if you were translating a Russian poem, and Mandelstam or Mayakovsky was talking about picking up a girl at a bar or something. I know Mayakovsky was famously political, but let's say he was, writing a poem and was using some kind of Russian sexual slang. And let's say if he was talking about a woman's, private parts, as say a badger, which might be a uniquely Russian thing. If you don't know that slang or that metaphor is used in that language, and you look up the word and it says, "Oh, badger," you're not necessarily going to get that connotation unless you really speak the language. So what might literally transliterated be badger in Russian could be, in American, it could be, some American slang for a woman's private parts or something. And yeah, so if you said badger, you would totally lose the sexual connotation that was in the original. So how do both of you, and I'll start with Bob and then go back to Ed. So how do you handle those metaphoric things that are unique to one language? Do you stick with the more faithful rendering, or do you say, well, that would be said in this way if I'm translating it into English? Bob, if you want to go first.
Yeah, well, there's an example of that in one of the Mandelstam poems I worked with. He uses the word Yaponets, which in Russian means a Japanese person. He's describing a bar that he went into, a rather shabby, shot-down bar. He said it was, all sorts of weird people are in there, Japonettes, people of no account, something like that. And I said, what does that mean? I mean, this is early in the 20th century. There weren't a lot of Japanese people in Moscow or Petersburg. In fact, they were at war with the Japanese.
Yeah, I was just going to say, the Russo-Japanese War.
And I was lucky to ask my friends who in the Russian department, no, they never heard that word in any other context except his literal movement. Finally, at the time, Hleb Struve, who was not quite a contemporary of Mandelstam's, but was a retired member of the Berkeley Slavic department, and who had edited the Russian text that I was using and was very generous about letting me use it. And I got in touch with him, called him and said that, or gave him a list of little questions. And he said he never heard Japonets either, for meaning anything other than a Japanese person. So it's when you sometimes give up on. You just say, well, it's whatever it meant to. Maybe he just meant strange people that he didn't recognize. You can't, it doesn't give you anything exciting as if he'd suggested the kind of private parts idea that you mentioned.
Yeah.
So
how about you, Ed? Have you encountered that as well?
Well, Rilke presents that problem probably more than most great modern poets. Part of his magic is the way he can balance on the high wire between a formal address and just and conversational closeness. But he's rarely idiomatic in that sense. I think that's why so many people think they can translate Rilke and want to translate Rilke and have a translation of the Sonnets to Orpheus on their computer somewhere. I can't tell you how many people have come up to me and say, "God, I love your translations of Sonnets to Orpheus. Would you like to read mine?" What he does have though is he will play that, and probably this is me as a kind of literary critic, close reader, kind of the way this is the way I read language, and but he'll use a phrase that challenges you because it seems to demand that you understand it in its formal sense, but then it seems to demand that you understand it in its idiomatic sense also. And it's bound to be a kind of complexity that a sensitive, tuned-in German reader is going to encounter in the German. But then, when you're a translator, you have to try to figure out which direction do you go in, and can you go in both at the same time. I'll just give you one example, a famous example. In the beginning of Autumn Day, the poem in Book of Images, 1906, it seems like the simplest line possible to translate from German into English because it's just total complete correspondence. So the English would be just a literal translation from word to word translation would be Lord, it is time, semicolon, the summer was, and then we get sehr gross, which is just so great. But there are probably about 10 translations of that poem now, and all of them differ only in how to do the sehr gross, as it were. I mean, there's no way you can translate Herr, Zeit, as any other way than Lord, it is time. The summer was, and then sehr gross. So let's, and I must say about 10 years ago, I sat down with someone I really liked, and he's a translator of other poets. I told him I'd just done a book of images. He said, "Oh, what did you do with the first line? What did you do with sehr gross?" And at that point, the best I was able to do was come up with immense. Yeah. Just any way to not have to say very great, yeah, or real, something, what do you do with that? And that was a translation until the last version of that poem, which I was allowed to revise for the kind of quote complete selected Rilke that I published a few years ago. I was just sitting around, and actually I was in a restaurant, and one of my friends who was doing the ordering and paying the bills said to tell the chef that was an excellent meal, And I realized that Sargrosis also has that idiom. I hadn't realized, and evidently none of the translators do either. Other translators do either. That it has that. In other words, if you're in a restaurant and the chef gives you a steak that's better than you've ever had before, you just say, that was sehr gross. That was brilliant. So it's the way you compliment somebody on, just at the lowest kind of everyday exchange. In other words, it's completely almost in conflict with this notion of, Lord, at this time, your summer was so great.
Yeah.
So, but the more I thought about it, that felt better to me, to try to kind of make him say something like that.
Yeah.
To the Lord, rather than it was very great, as in huge. And I think there's one translation on the internet that says, Lord, it was a great summer.
Yeah.
Which actually seemed to be more in the spirit of what I wanted, but of course a total catastrophe. So I finally, and these are the things that kind of, if you're a certain kind of translator, these are your little epiphanies, not when you do something very large, but when you finally solve one of these little inconsequential moments. And so the current translation says, Lord, it is time. Your summer was superb.
Yeah, it's. I was talking earlier about you cross-cultural, but there's also time as a culture. I could imagine someone during the summer of love translating that as the summer is so groovy.
Yeah. Of course, that would be, and that wouldn't be completely missing the spirit of the Rilke. And one of the things that's magic about Rilke is that he can write at that level and combine it with that with a kind of formal, almost the formal poise that he never drops.
All right. Well,
10-year-old.
Oh, go ahead, Bob.
If my 10-year-old grandson were translating it, he'd say it was awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's end this segment, and when we get back, we'll try to get Bob Tracy back on video, and we'll talk a bit more about poetry translation in the future and get a little bit more specific. And we'll do that in a moment.
Schwarze Katze, Rainer Maria Rilke. Ein Gespenst ist noch bei einer Stelle, dran dein Blick mit einem Klang stoßt. Aber da in diesem schwarzen Felle wird dein Starkstes schon aufgelost. Wat ento bender, wenn ihr in Wolster, Raserei in schwarzes sanft, Jallings en ben behenting gepolster, eine Selle auffort und verdampft. Alle Blicke, die sie jemals treffen, scheint sie also an sich zu verhellen, drobe drohend und verdrossen, so schon und damit du schelfen. Doch auf einmal kehrt sie, wie geweckt, ihr Gesicht und mitten in das deine. Und da triffst du deinen Blick in Gleam, aber ihre runden Augensteine und wartet wieder, eingeschlossen bei ein augusterbenes Insekt. Black Cat by Rainer Maria Rilke. Translation by Edward Snow. Even a ghost is like a place your glance bumps into with a sound. But here, when it encounters this black fur, your strongest gaze will be dissolved. The way a madman, when he is in fullest rage, pounds into the blackness, stops short at the sponge-like padding of a cell and drains away. All the glances that have ever struck her, she seems to conceal upon herself, so that she can look them over, morose and menacing, and sleep with them. But all at once, as if awakened, she turns her face straight into your own, and you unexpectedly meet your gaze in the yellow amber of her round eye-stones, closed in like some long-extinct insect.
Well, we're back with Bob and Ed. Bob's still having some issues with the video, but as long as we can hear him, we should be okay. One of the things that I wanted to ask, well, let me start with Mandelstam, and start with Bob, and then I'll ask a specific question regarding Rilke, since those seem to be the two poets. So welcome back, Bob. The two poets that are the most talked about. One of the things that I notice about Osip Mandelstam, and I've got 3 books of his right in front of me. I've got Your Stone, I've got the selected poems from Penguin, translated by James Green, and then I've got The Noise of Time, translated by a Clarence Brown. And I know my wife has a couple of other Mandelstams. And the remarkable thing about Mandelstam is no matter who translates him, he seems to be translator-proof. And there are a couple of other poets, and even as great as Rilke is, that's not the case, really. But Mandelstam, you can't screw him up. Yet, I have 5 or 6 Boris Pasternaks, and if I had read 5 of them, I would not think much of Pasternak. But the 6th one, and I forget who, it's brilliant. And so, what do you think, Bob, about Mandelstam makes him what I call translator proof? And do you agree that he is?
Well, obviously not, or I wouldn't have translated him, or even tried to. So I don't think of him as translator proof. I think of him as one of the things that attracts me to Mandelstam is his eagerness to make his own poetry part of not just a Russian tradition, but a European tradition. He's a very cosmopolitan poet, and he wants to make it clear that he sees himself not just in the tradition of Pushkin and the other great early 19th century Russian poets, but he wants to make it clear that he is part of the Greco-Roman tradition, that he wants to connecting himself with Ovid. He connects himself with Pushkin. The Ovid one, I think, is particularly interesting because it is his way of the metaphor that he uses after the revolution, when he finds himself in an exiled from the Russia that he knew before the revolution, the Russia of the Silver Age, when he and Akhmatova, Gumilev were Bloch, Biely, the poets of that period. He finds himself now in this strange new world, which is ultimately fatal to him. He's in trouble with it all the time, is because of his commitment to what he calls the integrity of the word, that you can't misuse words. You have to use words as if they were precious stones and use them handle with care, handle with great care. And that association with Ovid, I think, is very important. It's already there in his first book. And he's comes to identify not only as, remember that Ovid was exiled by the Emperor Augustus from Rome, sent to Scythia, a very savage place on the Black Sea, and that's where he spent, after he was exiled, that's where he spent his time. And in his, the reason he was exiled, Ovid himself tells us, was for two things: Carmen et error, for a song, or a poem if you like, and a mistake. And the poem, we know in Ovid's case, was probably the ars amatoria, the art of making love. The mistake was challenging Stalin by writing a poem about Stalin, in which he talks about how Stalin's voice drowns out every other voice in the Russia of that time, that only what Stalin says can be heard. So he's standing up always for the integrity of the word. And one can say that he died because because that poem that he wrote and read to a few people, one of them betrayed him by reporting it to the authorities, and that seems to be why he was arrested at the last moment of 1937 or 36 or 37, and as far as we know, died in a concentration camp in 38. So he was very, very committed to the sacredness of words, that you can't change the meanings of them, you can't fool around with them. You treat them as if they were sacred vessels or sacraments. Like that.
Just for historical accuracy, was it a concentration camp or was he in a Soviet gulag?
Well, it was a Soviet gulag,
okay.
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
It wasn't the Nazis were involved.
Yeah. Let me just ask you, and then I'll transition over to Ed with a segue. even with a great poet, there's going to be average poems, good poems, and then the great poems. Do you find yourself that it's easier to translate what's generally considered a great poem or a mediocre poem? Do you think when you come upon a poem that you've read others translate, then you say, well, that's not the best one, that I can somehow bring more to it? Or do you get intimidated by a great poem and think, well, I'm not going to, measure up, Bob?
Is this a question for me?
Yeah, and then I'll ask the same of Ed.
Okay, yeah. I think I think you get more excited. Some poems are more interesting than others, or better than others, if you can say better or worse. So I think the poems that I am attracted to, and probably handle most lovingly, are the ones that I do think are greater than the others. For example, in Mandelstam's second collection, Tristia, there's a poem called "The Man Who Finds a Horseshoe," and I think it's a wonderful poem. It's a long poem. It's got a great deal of reference in it, but it's one, to me, a high point. There are poems in Stone that are the same way. The poem about several of the poems about Ovid, poem about what's the other one? I'm sorry, I blocked on the other one. The poem about the Iliad, about falling asleep reading the Iliad. So I think that these are, they stand out for me, and they're the ones that I approach with, I guess, with a greater sense that they're sacred than if I were, than just the occasional poem that seems to be like comparatively slight or run-of-the-mill.
Okay, Bob.
All perfect.
I'm sorry, Ed. How about you? If you have, one of the lesser sonnets to Orpheus, or you have the Swan, does one of them fit more up your alley? Does one intimidate you more than the other?
I don't think Rilke has ever intimidated me. I was reading an interview with Gregory Rabassa, and was consoled to hear him say that he thought translating really good it was either he thought translating great poetry was easier than translating bad poetry. I think that's the way he put it, because that's how I'd always felt. One of the things that really kind of enabled my Rilke project to take off was that in a context where everyone was still doing selections, I decided to do complete books. So I did the complete books, complete first book of the new poems, and then the complete second book. So I didn't have the luxury of selection, and I must say that there are. It's amazing to find a book of poetry with 80 poems where maybe 60 of them you would call great or very good poems, and you've only got 14 that you wish weren't in there to deal with. But with Rilke, yes, there are some poems that seem to me so bad that then as a translator, you feel suddenly becomes your task, your obligation to make them not so bad. And the harder you try to make them not so bad, the worse they get. And you wind up feeling you've produced something in translation that's even worse than what's there in the German. And I pondered many times what makes this the case. I'm not quite sure. Whereas some of the poems like the Swan, or even Orpheus, Eurydice, Hermes, it's hard to translate that poem badly. I mean, and I don't know whether this is a thing that's uniquely characteristic of Rilke, or whether it's always the case. But great poems tend to be easier to translate than bad poems.
Yeah. You make a good point, Ed, because I know when I've read, and I was going to get into it, before Mitchell and you came along with Rilke. I mean, I've got the M.D. Herndon Norton, the McIntyre, and a handful of other people from the turn of the century and whatnot, and reading them against, say, Mitchell's best translations, your best translations, you can see images. You can get words that are just clunkily phrased, but the images they evoke are great, and they draw you in. But you're like, God damn it, they just didn't phrase that well. They didn't get. And it's sort of like if you're listening to, say, the greatest piece of music by Mozart or Beethoven, but you got bad headphones, and you just wish you could get some of that static out. Is that what you're trying to say? Something like that?
I never thought about it that way. Um, let's see, what was I? Yeah, I've been reading some poetry interviews lately online just to catch up with this. I think this is from a William Weaver interview. Where he said someone once told him that take your translation and shake it, and if it rattles, you need to work on it some more. Or maybe this was somebody talking about original poetry. So that your sense about getting the noise out of it is one thing. My sense is that, but kind of what you mentioned is a little kind of veers away from this issue of what's possible with poems that you feel are special, you know, that are among the best poems your poet wrote, and the ones that you just feel. I mean, I'm sure you feel the same thing if you read if you were German and you were translating a volume of Wallace Stevens from his middle period. Yeah. Except probably the ones you wished you didn't have to translate would be a greater majority, right? But there would be some there that would be brilliant and necessary, and my sense is that you would probably translate them more easily as well as more beautifully.
Bob, you look like you were ready to jump in to say something. Go ahead.
Well, I agree. I totally agree. I think the poet is at least is coming to it as a reader and as I suppose a critic, say he's really doing his best on this one, and he deserves the best response that I can make to this wonderful poem. So I do. Yes, I think that the better poem brings out the better in us as translators.
Let me step outside with a question that may at first seem out of left field, but I think really though has some relevance. And one of the things that I know that great artists often say is that it just came to me. I call this the divine inspiration fallacy. You know, greatness, you're going to have to work at it. All right, let me rephrase the question. I was going to ask a question that seemed a little out of left field, but I want to sort of bring it back to translation. I had mentioned what I call the divine inspiration fallacy, where a lot of great artists will say something just came to me, whereas I believe it also takes a lot of hard work. You can have all the great talent in the world, but if Beethoven didn't practice, he wouldn't have been Beethoven. In the same vein, in trying to get artificial intelligence, a lot of scientists have abandoned just playing with mathematical formula, and they've tried to put artificial brains inside of creatures that could grasp and hold things. And how I find this metaphorically relevant to translation is that I'm wondering if translator needs to get inside of a poem, to get inside of the original poet. For example, if you're translating, I know Ed has only translated one poet, so maybe it's more relevant to Bob, but if you're translating Akhmatova versus Mandelstam, do you get a different sense of a feeling? Do you see things in a certain different way when you're doing one poet's poem versus another? Do you feel certain inclinations? Bob?
Well, in the case you mentioned, yes, I certainly felt after translating 2 or 3 Akhmatova poems that this is an intensely feminine sensibility. And since I'm not female, I felt that I was trespassing into a place that should be left for someone who would instinctively feel the way she feels about certain love affairs or whatever she's talking about. It's very often love poems. Or poems of disappointed love or ending love. But I felt these poems, somebody is going to come along, some woman is going to come along who will want to translate these poems and will do it with the sensibility that I would not have. So I decided, and I thought, do I want to do Mandelstam or Gumilyov? Gumilyov is a great poet, but there's this little touch of Kipling about him, which is alien to me. So Mandelstam I felt much more sympathetic with, much more in tune with from the very beginning.
Now, Ed, you've only done Rilke, but do you find that when you are in that translation mode that you think or you encounter the world, you see things, you have a sensory perception is any different than you do as Ed Snow, perhaps?
That question is kind of difficult for me. I'll try to answer it, but then I'd be more interested in answering your question about embodiment. You know,
well, do the first one and then go back to embodiment.
I think this is just me speculating on myself. You know, so it doesn't have any real value. But I think one thing I like about translation is that it at least gives one the sensation. Of course, it can only be taken so far of becoming anonymous. So Ed Snow, I'm certainly never aware when I'm translating whether what's coming across is Ed Snow translating Rilke or Rilke being translated by somebody who is anybody and nobody at the same time. Probably one minor reason I've only translated Rilke is if I translated another poet, I'd have to face up to the fact, is it just Ed Snow? If I made Holderlin sound exactly like Rilke, then suddenly I would be failing at some level. But I think everybody who has, or at least everybody I've read recently, Rabassa, William Weaver, etc., who are committed to some version of accuracy, you know, some version of truth to the poem, always wind up offering up two criteria. One is accuracy, and then I'll always add some other thing. Like with Rabassa, I want to get accuracy, but I also want to get the flow. And William Weaver says I want to get accuracy, but I also want to get the feel of it. And so now, how you get the feel of it, and what you do as a translator to get the feel of it or get the flow of it, I don't think you can kind of be thinking about that while you translate consciously, but it's kind of the main thing. It's a thing that's going to determine whether the translation is dead or alive. Just briefly, when my translation started coming out, I get a lot of criticism saying, "Well, he's very accurate, but he just doesn't have an ear for poetry," and I would have nothing to say to that because, you know, judging whether somebody has an ear for poetry can vary so wildly from reader to reader. But one guy who liked it says, well, he may not have an ear for poetry, but he manages to create psychological presence. And I don't think he just meant that psychological characters or psychological feelings within the poem somehow came alive, but it was his word for flow or feel. And I've always been haunted by that term. You know, it always seems to me a rich term for thinking about translation, or maybe any fiction at all. Does it have psychological presence in it? Now, of course, if you get to a certain point, maybe you begin dealing with writers who are deliberately trying to avoid the kind of old humanistic criterion of psychological presence. But it strikes me as a potentially kind of complicated, kind of uncanny term for what you're calling embodiment.
Well, you said you wanted to speak more on the embodiment, so go ahead.
That's what I just did. That would be,
Okay.
instead of embodiment, I would say, yeah, psychological. Is it alive? But then what is it? Then everything becomes a theoretical question immediately, and I avoid translation theory, like the plague. Like a chairmaker would avoid theories of chairs.
Yeah. You actually provided a nice segue to my next question, and I'll ask this of Ed first, and then go over to Bob. I was just looking over the selected poems of Rilke done by Robert Bly, and one of the things that I've never been a big fan of Bly's Rilke translations or any of his translations, and the basic reason is the almost exact opposite of why I think Mitchell and your translations work, is that there's too much Bly in every one of his translations. Bly can be doing Rilke, he could be doing a Latin American poet, he can be doing a Russian. I've even seen him do I think he did Rumi, and it's all his Bly. And whereas with Mitchell and you, there's more fidelity. And one of the reasons I think this is just my theory, and you don't have to feel, I don't want to put anyone on the spot, but I did read Stephen Mitchell's collected poems, or not, he released a poem book about 20 some years ago, and when I came on tour and I met him, I said to him, and I asked him this very question, I said, and I don't mean to offend you, but your own poems are just sort of blob. They just sort of sit there. There's no demiurge the way Rilke or Mandelstam or some great poet has. The problem, I think, with someone like Bly is Bly himself in his early youth had a demiurge. You can argue about whether he ever came through with it, but he was there. And so if you have this creative impulse from the translator going against with a great creative impulse from the source poet, you're at loggerheads. But if you're someone who is technically skilled but necessarily doesn't have that own vision, that demiurge, you can sort of absorb the original source poet more and bring it into the other language more easily. Does that make sense to either of you, Ed or Bob?
Bob, why don't you take that one?
Yeah, Bob? Well, yes, I think since I'm not myself a poet, there's no persona to get in the way of trying to transmit the poet that I'm translating, since I don't have a voice. I don't have unlike Bly, for example, I don't have a recognizable voice of my own. And I think that's always the problem when a poet translates a poem, whose poet we know already very well, somebody like Seamus Heaney, for example, whose own voice is very familiar. When he translates, it's a good translation, but it does sound a little like a Seamus Heaney poem. Bly is more obviously Bly all the time, and I think yes, it happens. I think that there should be there's a certain degree, perhaps there should be a certain degree of invisibility or anonymousness for the translator.
Yeah.
You're a transmitter, not an original poet. You're a transmitter of a poem.
And just before this interview, I was looking up some Rilke translations who also done, and Galway Connell is another good example. His translations, whether he's doing Rilke or other people, are always Connellian. But Ed, do you have a comment?
Well, yeah, it's especially with poets like Rilke, I think as a translator, you feel like one of the essential things that you need to try you can't be thinking about it, but you can be hoping that you're succeeding in it is conveying some sense of the voice, but not a voice like the one I'm using now. It's so Rabassa would rather call it, the flow, and Weaver would rather call it the feel, but as you translate, you feel it's kind of quintessentially Rilke, right? But it's not, and so yes, anonymous, self-effacing, but yet, the kind of the kind of hope that you entertain as your folly is that you are actually bringing Rilke across, into the English language, that somehow in some way, people are hearing Rilke, which of course then I mean it's a completely unsupportable claim or even desire. So I'm just saying it now, to between the three of us, but I think every poet really wants to feel that success would be to feel that somehow the poet he or she is creating is really vibrantly alive in the new language.
Let me just ask maybe this final question, this segment, and then we'll come back and we'll wrap up the interview with giving you both closing remarks. In the 21st century here, I mentioned earlier how, every 20 or 30 years there seems to be, at least with great poets, new translations. I mean, how many times have the Iliad and the Odyssey and the Aeneid been translated? I mentioned Constance Garnett, and certainly the Russian prose masters are translated every quarter century or so. Marcel Proust has been translated a number of times with each generation. Do you think that that's necessarily a good thing? I mean, do you think that, say, in 2030 or 2050, if a new translation of Mandelstam, of Akhmatova, or of Rilke comes out, is something lost by trying to, quote unquote, bring it into the next century or bring it to a new generation? Is there too much of a striving to make something relevant when maybe part of its greatness is rooted in its time and place? Either one.
Well, I think that I'm not sure that the 21st century is that different from the 20th, and that there would be that particular need for a new version. If somebody is moved to write a new version, to prepare a new version, as Ed was to prepare Rilke, as I was to prepare Mandelstam, it could happen any time, and I don't think it has much to do with its change from a 20th century sensibility to a 21st century sensibility. I think that there will always be people who say, I can do a better job, and they may be right. Certainly, Richard Prevere and his collaborator, to me, does a better job than Constance Garnett did, translating Crime and Punishment, which happens to be a book I very recently taught. So I've been very enmeshed in it, and really checking from time to time at any passages that needed some. And I needed to look at the Russian to say, is this really what it says? And usually it really is what, I say, yeah, okay, didn't sound quite right to me, but that's the way it is. That's what the text says. The thing I found very interesting about doing that was to realize how a very simple thing, and I think this is curiosity of translating. A very simple thing is that in Russian and in French, and once upon a time in English, we had a singular, a second person singular. You could say thou or thy. Now you can't say that anymore. It would be ridiculous. In Russian, you still say that. And just working through Crime and Punishment, when somebody uses the second person singular, which is the intimate form of address, the variations of that are fascinating. They go up and down. if you remember the novel, there is a very angry scene between Raskolnikov's sister and the evil Svidrigailov, who would like to rape her. And she's very ambiguous in certain ways. She a couple of times uses the second person singular to this guy who's at the moment holding her and he's locked the door behind her and he's up to no good. She eventually shoots at him and wings him, but you have this fluctuating mood. What is she up to here? I think that kind of, and I can't think of any way you could do that in a translation of the text without saying, a footnote saying, here she's using the intimate form, which would get in the way of reading. But the Russian reader has that. The French, somebody reading it in French translation has that. So it's one of the many problems that at this point in my life I see as insoluble. How would you, if I were, which I'm not going to do, translate crime and punishment?
Okay.
That would be very embarrassing.
All right. Ed, do you have a comment?
Well, yeah, Rilke is probably presents the most spectacular instance for thinking about translations and then more translations and then more translations. Since, well, for instance, since my translations of Rilke, or let's just say of Duino Elegies, I think there are 5 new translations already. I mean, so translations seem to be, the quantity of translations in this period of time seem to be increasing exponentially. So I'm not sure how to understand this new desire to translate. I'm not sure whether to understand it positively or negatively. In the case of Rilke, it's just baffling, because there can be, I mean, William Gass already in reading Rilke starts off one of his chapters by quoting the opening lines to the first sonnet to Orpheus by the existing 12 translations in English, and now there are already 5 more translations in English. So why do people keep translating the sonnets to Orpheus in English and with only minimally successful results vis-a-vis their predecessors? I mean, one could be generous and say there's something about Rilke that just makes one, in the process of reading him, decide I need to do more than read this guy. I need to translate him.
Bob, you still there? My guess would be, as someone who spent many years going to poetry groups and running poetry groups, I think a lot of people, a friend of mine once said, let me put it this way, that the reason people want to be poets is because you just need a pen and a paper. You don't need to buy an easel. You don't need to buy a big piano to compose stuff. You just pen and paper. I think a lot of it has to do with people just wanting to, be able to say, oh, I translated Rilke. I think there's a cachet. Or I translated. I've known people who've done translations, say, of Whitman into different languages, into Spanish and whatnot. So I think there's a cachet part of it that comes with it. But Bob, are you still there?
Yep.
Okay. We just lost your video.
I do too.
We're gonna end this segment, and when we get back, we'll wrap up the interview, and I'll give both of you closing remarks, and hopefully we'll get you back on video, and we'll do that in a moment.
Leichenwäsche, Rainer Maria Rilke. Sie hatten sich eingewohnt, doch als der Kutschenlamp kam und brannte im dunklen Lutzwig, war der Unbekannte ganz unbekannt. Sie wuschen seinen Hals, und da sie nicht von seinem Schicksal wussten, so lagen sie in anderer zusammen, fortfahren forschend. Eine musste husten und ließ schon lang den schweren Essigschwamm auf dem Gesicht. Da gab es eine Pause, auch für das Zweit. Aus der harten Bürste klampften die Trümpfen, waren seine große, gekrampften Hand dem ganzen Hause beweisen wollte, dass nicht mehr dürste. Und bewies, sie nahmen bei Betreten, Lager jet mit einem kurzen Huster.
die Arbeit auf, so dass an den tappten, ihr krummer Schatten in dem stummen Muster, sich wand und wolze wie in einem Nitze, bis das die Wuschenden du Ende kamen, die nach im vorhanglosen Fenster haben, war rücksichtslos, und einer ohne Namen, lag bar und reinlich da und gab Gesetze. Corpse Washing by Rainer Maria Rilke. Translation by Edward Snow. They had grown used to him, but when the kitchen lamp came and burned restlessly in the dark draught, the one unknown there was utterly unknown. They washed his neck, and since they knew nothing of his fate, they made up another one between them, all the while washing. The first had to cough, and left the heavy vinegar-soaked sponge lying on his face. Then there was a pause, while the other rested. From her hard brush the drops kept falling, while his terrible cramped hand tried to make the whole room see that he no longer thirsted. And he succeeded. With a short cough, as if embarrassed, they took up the work more urgently, so that on the wallpaper their hunched shadows writhed and twisted in the mute patterns as though in a net, until the washings came to an end. The night in the curtainless window frame was pitiless, and one without names lay there bare and clean and issued laws.
Well, we are going to end this interview with Ed Snow and Bob Tracy. I'm just going to give both of them just a minute or two to talk about what maybe they have coming up in terms of books coming out, or any other final thoughts they want to talk about poetry or translation. So let me start with you, Bob, since I've got your video. Bob, do you have a new book coming out? Any final thoughts?
I don't have a publisher yet, but I have translated Tristia, Mandelstam's second volume, and I've published a few of them in journals, and I'm basically very satisfied with it. But as far as I can tell, Princeton is no longer interested in publishing poetry and translation, and my own university press is not interested in publishing anything to do with literature at the moment. So I haven't, if anybody suggests does publish, I think Ohio State does, but I'm not sure.
Probably
Anyway,
some memoirs.
What's that?
Probably they're only publishing now memoirs of someone being abused by their Uncle Sven.
Something like that, yes. So anyway, I do have a book in pretty much complete, but I haven't. I've had some ill health, so I haven't been pushing that.
Well, anyone who's interested, they can contact Bob. If you look below this video, there will be a link to his page where I actually contacted him. Or if you're interested, you can always send me an email, and I can put you in touch with Bob if anyone has an interest in publishing the second book of Mandelstam's poem. Ed, do you have any final comments or a book coming out?
Well, I'll tell you just briefly my current project. I thought I was finally finished with Rilke when I was able to publish that The Poetry of Rilke.
He keeps bringing you back in, like they said in The Godfather 3. He just keeps bringing you back in.
But the one thing I left out of that was the long requiem to Paula Becker-Motersong. I think most biographers feel is probably the woman that is at the heart of all of Rilke's grief. It's a great poem, but it's just Rilke's longest poem. And I've never been able to get any handle on it at all. No psychological presence. Patches of boredom with occasional flashes. So I kind of reconcile myself to just letting other people do their best with that poem. And then I sat down 2 summers ago, and it just bang. It just like, it's never happened to me before. but suddenly a poem that was felt completely dead to me just came alive. And I know you don't like the demiurgical, theory of poetry, but all I can say was that every other time I'd sat down with this poem, everything I'd written had been even flatter than what I thought I was reading, and suddenly everything just click, 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 click. So I've translated that poem now. It's the last poem by Rilke I have any desire to translate. And right now I have the desire of what kind of context to create for it. It's an incredible biography around it, full of mystery. So right now I'm kind of trying to figure out a way to provide biographical context in a way that will feel deconstructive to biography.
Okay, well, let's end this interview, and I thank both of you for an enjoyable interview. By the way, I don't have anything against demiurges. I just don't like ascribing them to anyone other than the individual who's urging. If you enjoyed this interview on poetry translation with Bob and Ed, in a couple of days I will actually be doing another interview with a man named Harold Wright, who's also translated some Japanese poets and is also a storyteller. And tomorrow I'll actually be doing an interview with an expert on Genghis Khan and the Mongol Empire. So that should be interesting in the next couple of days. So again, I want to thank Bob and Ed. Thank you for your insights. Thank you for your contributions to translation and literature. And thank you for being on this show.
Thank you very much for inviting us.
Okay.